I worked as a bartender for an Irish-style pub in O'Hare's airport for, well, longer than I'd care to admit. Anyway, it was the closest bar to the United terminal, and thus many a weary traveler's first stop off the plane, last stop before the plane. And I've met all kinds here. The anxious first-time flyer, the seasoned once-a-month business tripper, self-proclaimed explorers, and rich college kids. You name it. All land and take off from Mickey's Pub, if you forgive the pun. The thing I loved the most about the people were their stories. And the young man who sat at the stool closest to the tap just a little over a day and a half ago, his story takes the cake. Thin Air, by Theo Plesha, performed by Needham. I've heard them all, from the mundane to the traveling nightmare, to the strange coincidence. I remember a gent named James Mayfield flew into a bar stool one night and went to spin me a yarn about how his flight had made excellent time because of the tailwind. And because of the early arrival, he incidentally discovered his long-distance girlfriend, who he had just flown out to see, was cheating on him. And then, of course, there was Miss Lauren Naylor. Her taxi's flat tire made her miss her flight on the day of the body bombings. And then, years later, a connecting flight delay caused her to miss boarding a cruise ship that disappeared a few years ago. All great stories, but that young guy, his ID said his name was Greg Reeves Jr. He was a 21-year-old kid, thin, mop of hair on his head, and he had this absolutely lost, petrified look in his face as he shambled his way through the faux wooden doors and into the ethereal flow of low Irish session background music. I immediately took him for a fear of flying / first-time flyer type, and I suggested he slug down a shot of Jameson with a beer and take the edge off. My words seemed to fly right past him. He stared through the taps with his mouth half agape and his eyes batting slowly in stunned blinks. After a minute or so, I crossed my arms and, impatiently peering down at him as he slowly mounted the stool, I began to wonder if he needed help, or, more importantly, if he needed to leave because he already was intoxicated on in-flight booze, or maybe some kind of Valium. After a few more shaky seconds, he finally seemed to acknowledge my existence, and then, choking on his dry tongue, ordered a double ginger and JMO. He flashed a wad of cash, so my worries took a back seat, and I made his order. "Rough first flight? Where you from?" "Near Cincy," he stammered. "It's my first time flying since..." He trailed off, while I mentally patted myself on the back for guessing his deal. I turned around with the cold amber drink in my hand and set it in front of him, and that's when I noticed he was sweating more than the glass. "Since what?" I asked, looking around the bar, noting that, aside from a quiet couple at a two-top, we were the only ones here. It was still early morning on a Tuesday. He took a long pull off the straw, and then his eyes suddenly seemed to pop back to life. "Since," and he coughed up the part of the drink, "do you really want to hear my story?" I smiled and chuckled. "Sure, why not, kid? Just don't make it all day. I don't got all day." "Nah, that ain't true. But do make it kind of short. Flight 1... I trailed off. I realized the kid wouldn't know the significance of the flight number. New York plane is due soon, and I got a few regulars that are going to pop in here for an Irish coffee or 5. "I grew up in Warren, Ohio." He looked at me like I didn't know what he was talking about. "That's the town with all the weird..." "Warren," I interrupted him, because I, in fact, did know the significance. "That's the place with all the weird weather back about 10 years ago." Greg's eyes grew wide and locked onto mine. "Yeah, that Warren, Ohio. You guys had all the freaky storms, right? Like the one that all the mites were carried in on the dust." Greg downed his drink, then exhaled. "Oh my God, the dust sucked. smothered the whole county, but the mites came a day or two after that had cleared. They got everywhere. Any place you could possibly find dust, there they were. Everyone I knew had bites or rashes all over their body. It felt like they were crawling, eating away between the layers of your skin. They were in your ears, your nose, your tear ducts. The way some people looked when they had their rash breakouts, no doctor could tell them differently. Seemed like the kid had some of the childhood trauma pent up in him. I ain't no doctor, but I recognize my role as a caregiver, of sorts. Maybe I should have gone back to school to be a shrink or something. My eyes glanced quickly at his empty drink. He fired back an affirmative nod. We also had this once-in-a-lifetime fall thunderstorm with the most constant lightning you've ever seen. Apparently, a huge flock of Canadian geese were confused by the thunder and lightning, and well, it literally cooked those geese. They fell all around town. Everywhere you looked, there were burnt and mangled goose carcasses, smashed in the roofs, on the streets, and through windshields. The coyotes had a field day. One goose smashed right through my skylight and landed at the foot of my bed. Can you imagine being a kid and having a partially burned, dying goose flopping around, its neck cut by broken glass, bleeding out on your bed, all of it backlit by strobing lightning? I paused before replying, as he seemed genuinely mortified at reliving this moment. 2 customers walked in and sat at the far hook of the bar. "Nah," I said, and politely forced a smile towards the 2 newcomers. "Tell you what, kid, next one's on the house. When I get back, I got questions for you." Living in Chicago, you get plenty of strange weather. That old saying about not liking the weather and waiting for an hour for it to change is true. I guess hearing about and talking about weather is a hobby of mine. Maybe because it makes it easier to live with. Call me intrigued by the kids' first-hand accounts of some of the strangest weather I've ever heard of. And if you follow any weather news or watch any strange weather documentaries, one of those incidents stands out in my mind. Probably stands out in your mind too. I guess it goes by a lot of nicknames depending on who you listen to. The Squid, El Toro, the Bull, the Ace of Spades, the Reaper, Dead Man Walking. All names for a massive F5 tornado caught on film, which spawned smaller tornadoes horizontally like an octopus spreads its tentacles, or like massive horns from a charging bull, out from its mile-wide base as it circled the town of Warren. One of those docs I seen said that this phenomena was exclusive to that particular tornado, never seen before or since. I poured the newcomers a couple of Guinness drafts and made my way back to Mr. Reeves, who was gnawing at his fingernails. I made him the promised 3rd drink and asked him what it was like to see that tornado firsthand. "Yeah," he said, distantly, "it was pretty intense." Well, I was left unfulfilled by his follow-up. "Well, lucky it dissipated before it hit the town, right? No one died." Greg rubbed his 5 o'clock shadow. "My dad was in a plane that day. He was basically a crop duster pilot. I haven't flown since he was around." What can I say? I struck a nerve, but I was hooked at this point, and I had little else to do. "Your dad used to take you up?" I danced around the fact that I thought he was trying to say his dad may have died in flight because of the tornado. I just wanted to know more about that day. "Yeah, the thing was back then, he used to take pictures from the air of people's crops and then spray, help farmers find the wet spots and other trouble spots in their crops and their fields. You can do that now with a drone, but back then, yeah, that was my dad's thing. We'd fly all the time. I'd never thought it'd get this way." His voice seemed to trail off, then suddenly came back strong. "Clouds!" he exclaimed. "My dad always said never fly through the clouds, especially the little puffy low ones. He never said why." "Turbulence and visibility would be my guess, especially in a little plane. Not as big a problem for a jumbo jet. But what do I know? I only work for the airport. I don't know jack about flying." "Any pilot will tell you not to fly through the puffy clouds. But anyway, my dad knew I loved flying and everything about the sky. He gave me this model rocket with a little camera in it. You know, those cardboard rockets. It's got a little firework motor and pops a parachute out at the end. This one also took pictures all the way down on a little roll of film. Anyway, I remember the first day I got it, and we lit it up twice, and on the third flight, my dad had to go inside for something. I don't recall what. I did something I thought was impossible. I stacked a few of the rocket engines together and then aimed it at the low, puffy cloud. I was curious to see if I could reach it. Curious to see if I could see what was inside. He made rocket noises and zipped his fingers up from the bar towards the ceiling. Shoo! Pop! I killed the cloud. I killed that cloud. Now I should have cut him off right there. I should have also asked him to go, but I was too damn locked in on this kid and his face and how sober he sounded when he went on. He described the cloud popping in the sky like someone punctured a water balloon with all the water popping out and bits of latex skittering off. He told me that it seemed to make an expression, a sorrowful, terrified face sunken in the fading wisps that boiled away right after the rocket had popped it. That was the day it all started, Greg declared. I was soaked. Never found that rocket again, and I was sad. And that night, we had the reddest sunset I had ever seen. I started seeing faces in the clouds. I thought it was just my imagination, of course. I didn't tell anyone. Who's going to care if an 11-year-old kid talks about the stuff he sees in the clouds? Anyway, at first, they were sad faces, like Greek tragedy masks everywhere I looked in the sky. Then the faces turned menacing, almost demonic, always hanging just within sight, whether it was riding in the car or out the window at school all day. I refused to go flying with my dad again. I put a poster over my skylight so I wouldn't have to see the faces. And then it got worse. A swarm of large dust devils ruined my Little League game, which could have brought us to state. The clouds, the weather, they followed me everywhere. Even up on my 12th birthday, we took a trip to Disney World. It rained every day. It rained every day so much that they closed most of the parks, and we were stuck inside almost the whole time. Then the real dangerous weather started, the stuff that you heard about. At this point, I felt like I needed a drink and closure. So your dad, your flight today, all of this? Well, a day before El Toro, he was hired to take photos over a cornfield damaged by a huge hailstorm the previous week. My dad showed me the photos when he confronted me. The hail damage carved into the crop spelled out in vague but still clear words. Greg. 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 My name. Dad warned me about never flying through the clouds. He seemed to already know what I did. Otherwise, why confront me? I confessed. I told him about the rocket and the cloud. And then, the day of El Toro, he took off from the little airport during the storm. And then the tornado and the storm seemed to just miraculously disappear. The authorities found my dad's plane completely intact in an empty field with no sign of him. They searched for 2 weeks from the ground, from the air, divers in a small nearby lake. He never found his body. And that's when the storm stopped? Yeah, the storms and the clouds stopped. I mourned my dad with my mom and sister. We went on with our lives. We moved away. I finished middle and high school. I went to college, found a job, and it turns out it requires travel. It brings me to you here and now. I thought it was going to be okay to fly again. What do you mean? Well, we hit cruising altitude, and I was just beginning to relax. I pulled up my shade, and it was a nice, clear dawn weather. But there he was. There was my dad, standing on the cloud shelf, just close enough to see his wispy, icy blue face. It was like he was part of the cloud and part ice. He was entombed but still alive. His eyes met mine. He was buried alive in the sky. He turned, and his mouth opened like he was screaming at me, for anyone. I gasped and shut the shade, kept it shut for the remainder of the flight. The kid went on for a bit longer as I started to become less entranced and less enthralled with his story, and increasingly considered calling some sort of mental health authority for him. Needless to say, I silently cut him off, but he didn't ask for another drink anyway. He went on to say that the image of his father imprisoned in the sky has shaken him. He was worried that the clouds would now remember him as the real killer and would come after him again. I blinked a few times and said nothing. He seemed to stare at me for any help I could offer in this time of crisis. I walked away trying to figure out what I was going to do for this kid as I served a couple of new patrons. While I was talking to them, the kid just jumped up and hurried for the door. Good riddance, I thought, after I checked to see if he had left any cash. I finished making a few rounds of Irish coffee for the New York rush and came back to his stool. I noticed the generous tip that he had left, alongside a bar napkin on which he had wrote, "It's happening again," and an arrow was pointing behind me. Kid had actually parked himself in front of the TV with the Weather Channel on. They were going on about some sort of breaking news, a particularly dangerous situation. A level 5 out of 5 tornado outbreak event forecast to strike Chicago from the west later in the day. The Weather Channel. What do they know? Nothing. Because nothing like it happened that evening, overnight, or the next morning. I put it all out of my head until the cops showed up a little after noon. There were 2 detectives. One was a federal air marshal, and the other an airport cop, or maybe he was some bigwig with TSA. The marshal was by the book, serious. But the other guy, the TSA guy, or whatever he was a bit more off. He wandered around the stool Greg had sat in while the marshal grilled me. They were asking for security footage from the previous morning, and then finally about Greg. Did he say what he was doing here? Where was he going? Where was he from? What did he say? Anything weird? Blah, 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 blah. I happily gave them the footage and the non-crazy Cliff Notes version of this story. All of their questions seemed to be leading that he had suffered some sort of mental break and then either had been found dead or maybe they were concerned he was some sort of flight risk. Apparently the kid never showed up to his work conference, and instead, after leaving my bar, caught the first plane heading west before the storms were due. The marshal finished up with me after a few notes and seemed to be heading for the door. I asked him what had happened to Greg. The marshal said he could not comment on an ongoing investigation. The TSA agent, on the other hand, seemed like he wanted to spill the beans, but was being gagged by his superior. An hour later, the same TSA guy came back in, called me over. He told me, in no uncertain terms, that 253 people boarded the flight to Denver, and 252 got off. There was no signs of a mid-air decompression or any other event, or any kind of flight problem at all. They checked the cargo hold. They checked the whole plane. The septic tanks. They were checking the flight path, post-landing gear deployment. Nothing. Nada. Zip. As the saying goes, and the whole reason I'm putting this out there, Greg Reeves Jr. seems to have disappeared into thin air.